Tiz, a vulnerable young Brazilian girl, finds herself speeding through the night towards the lights of a big city. Her companion is a man who has promised her parents that he will find their daughter work as a maid. What awaits her there is something different, however, and her life becomes increasingly fraught with danger, both mental and physical.
Interwoven into this tragic and violent storyline is the account of a young doctor whose life and love affair in the south of England are in stark contrast to the dangerous, sexually abusive situation in which Tiz finds herself. Yet their stories and that of their families become closely linked. You are listening to Tiz from the novel The Garden of Sparkling Delight by Deborah Vaughan.
Part 6. Tourists' Delight. Tiz continues her life in the Sparkling Delight brothel, where she is held captive by doing the cooking and cleaning. The day comes, however, when she is forced to begin work as a prostitute. Her first client is Aidan, on holiday again from the UK. Tiz finds the experience life-shattering, as does Aidan. A few days later, uncle and nephew were again sitting on the terrace, relaxing after their midday meal. Over the estuary, a formidable bank of storm clouds were gathering, moving inexorably towards the sun like an invading army.
"There's a carnival in town tomorrow," announced Reese, glancing up at the darkening sky. "Let's hope this has gone by then. Would you like to go?" And he looked inquiringly at Aidan. "Cool, uncle," replied Aidan enthusiastically. He'd been getting bored with the diet of shopping malls and cinemas. He'd even tired of the beach with its constant parade of bikini-clad girls, who only served to remind him of his loneliness. If only Jake had been with him, he would have spent more time on the bustling streets with their vendors, street musicians, and dancers. But he'd found these a little scary on his own. The carnival, therefore, sounded like a brilliant way to pass the time. "Don't wait up for me this evening, though," Reese went on. "I'm going out to a business meal."
After dinner, Aidan went up to bed. He soon fell asleep, but woke about 1 o'clock in the morning feeling thirsty. His room, which was at the front of the hotel, was dimly lit by the lights outside his window, so he had no need to put on his bedside lamp, but got straight out of bed and padded across to the wash basin for a drink of water. Wandering over to the window, glass in hand, he glanced out at the road below. As he watched, a taxi turned into the deserted street, and, to his surprise, Aidan saw his uncle get out, looking dishevelled and very drunk. He lurched up the hotel steps, helped by the taxi driver, and Aidan winced as he heard his uncle's loud laughter and saw him stumble against the hotel door.
Should I go down and help him? He wondered. However, he dismissed the idea, saying to himself that Reese would be angry if he did. So he watched until he was sure the night porter had let his uncle in, and then went thoughtfully back to bed.
So the days went by. Aidan was now sleeping well, and waking one morning at the end of his holiday, he lay lazily in bed, hands behind his head, feeling completely at home in his opulent surroundings.
Amazing. I must have slept for about 9 hours, he said to himself in astonishment. And if sleep knits up the ravelled sleeve of care, as Shakespeare seemed to think it did, then it must have knitted me a complete woolly jumper in the night. Laughing drowsily at his own wit, he climbed into his shorts and t-shirt before making his way onto the terrace for breakfast. I could get used to this, he thought wryly, as he looked round and found a waiter hovering at his elbow with a large glass of iced orange juice on a tray before he'd hardly sat down. Later, Reese joined him, looking decidedly the worst for wear, and after he had satisfied his gargantuan appetite, he sat back in his chair, rubbed his protruding stomach lovingly, and asked, "Like to visit a national park today, Aidan? It's a sort of cross between a safari park and a small wildlife reserve, he explained. Bit like Whipsnade. There's an excursion you can join which takes you there in a bus from the town centre. It'll give you an opportunity to see a bit of the countryside. It's just the sort of place, he added, your father would have gone to. He liked animals. Can't think why. I shan't come. Not my cup of tea. Got business to do anyway. Aidan jumped at the idea, as this was the last full day of the holiday. I wonder if he really has a meeting, or whether it's the thought of all those animals, he pondered. Either way, I'm glad he's not coming.
The excursion started from the city centre, and Aidan got onto a smart tour bus along with a mixture of rich Brazilians and sightseers like himself. He had taken the precaution of grabbing a bottle of water, some chocolate and a snack from the hotel, which he carried in a small backpack. As the coach made its way along increasingly worsening roads, he munched on a chocolate bar and mused on the vast differences between his world and this new country where he felt so out of place and alien. The bus eventually arrived at a large compound where it drew up in a cloud of dust. The tour then transferred to the small dilapidated buses which were to drive them round the reserve. These were furnished with uncomfortable metal seats, and, to make matters worse, everything was covered in a layer of fine red dust. Many of the passengers tried to wipe this away, but it was an impossible task, and there was much grumbling as they gingerly lowered themselves onto the seats.
I wish I had put my black chinos on, Aidan thought regretfully as he looked at the red smear on his cream trousers. He tried to clean it off with his hanky, but this only seemed to make it worse. In the end he gave up and instead looked around him at his fellow passengers. In front of him sat a rich Brazilian mother and her little boy. The latter was about 4 years old and was dressed in a neat matching outfit of linen shirt and trousers, topped off with an expensive pair of miniature dark glasses. These gave him a rather sinister appearance. Indeed, with his slicked down dark hair, he looked just like a miniature member of the mafia. Aidan watched him closely as the child pressed his small nose hard against the grubby window pane. The bus started off and they jolted and bumped their way to the park's special monkey section, passing through a complex barrier which their guide told them was to prevent monkey escape artists from getting out of their enclosure. They came to a rest under a large tree, and soon the windows were festooned with monkeys, who hung down from the roof and climbed up on the wheels to peer in. Are we looking at them, or are they looking at us? Aidan wondered, and was particularly amused by one upside-down monkey, who stared at the small child in the seat in front, with its tiny face pressed close to the glass. This made the little boy very excited, and he jumped up and down on his seat, shouting, "Vai embora, vai embora!" which Aidan presumed was the Portuguese equivalent of "go away." Embora would make a good name for you, he thought to himself, and smiled at the small boy's exuberance.
Following the monkey enclosure, the bus swayed and rocked its rickety way round the rest of the park, seeming indeed to travel several kilometres. Often the animals were hidden in the bushes, but much to Aidan's delight they did see some agoutis and even a giant anteater. Embora greeted every sighting with the same exuberance, which began to irritate Aidan.
"I wish you were less of a pain," he sighed to himself. "I'll be glad when we get back and you're home in your luxury apartment or wherever you live. I'd be grateful too for a padded seat and a smooth ride," he added, wriggling uncomfortably. "Top marks to the man who invented foam rubber." When they got back to the entrance compound, he was therefore relieved to sink down onto his dust-free seat in the luxury tour bus that was to take them back to the city. By now, Mbora was really tired and curled up with his head on his mother's lap. He went to sleep, much to everyone's relief.
Aidan sat back, ready to enjoy the journey home in the comfort of the air-conditioned coach. As the bus sped along, he gazed out at the passing scenery and whiled away the time eating his remaining chocolate bars and drinking water from his bottle, feeling relaxed and sleepy. At first, all went well, but then he became aware that the tour bus was slowing down and that an odd noise was coming from the engine. Slower and slower it went until at last it lurched off the main highway onto an unmade road and painfully chugged its way to the edge of a large village. There it came to a juddering halt on the dusty forecourt of a ramshackle garage. The driver stood up, mopped his forehead, and in halting English announced,
"Bus broken, must mend it." "How long is that going to take?" demanded a portly American seated at the front. "Not long, not long," replied the driver, waving his hands in the air. "Very quick, 1 hour only." And again he waved his hands over his head. Now that the air conditioning was no longer working, the bus began to get very hot and, worse still, Mbora woke up and began to cry. In desperation, Aidan decided he would go for a walk to see if he could observe at close hand how ordinary rural Brazilians lived. It's an opportunity too good to miss, and anyway, I can't survive even an hour of cross passengers and fractious children, he said to himself, and set off towards the straggle of houses that marked the edge of the village. In no time at all, he'd reached the main street. But even here, the houses were well spaced, and everywhere he looked, Aidan could see scrawny chickens scratching at the dust and skinny dogs sleeping in the shade. Although it was very hot, a few village boys were kicking a ball around in a half-hearted manner. But they stopped when they saw him, and stood and stared until he had gone past. Some of the houses were built of concrete, he noticed, but the majority were ramshackle shacks that were obviously homemade. Halfway along the village street, he came upon a small shop, and it proved to be full of boxes and sacks of local food, most of which he didn't even recognize. Nobody much was about, but since it was the hottest part of the day, Aidan reasoned that they were all indoors sheltering from the heat. He wandered aimlessly on until the houses began to thin out and it seemed that there was nothing else to see. Up ahead, however, he could see a large shady jacaranda surrounded by the last 2 or 3 shacks. Drawing nearer, Aidan saw that these dwellings were even more dilapidated than those in the main village, and obviously belonged to the very poorest in the community.
Still nobody about. Then a small movement caught his eye at the side of one of the shacks, and he strolled over to investigate. He found himself looking down at the huddled form of a young boy curled up in a small patch of shade. His little body was painfully thin and covered in dust and sores, and when the child, sensing his presence, turned his head and looked up at him, Aidan was startled to see a pair of huge eyes round which crawling flies clustered. The boy gazed dully at him, but just how long child and tourist looked at each other, Aidan was never able to say. It could have been a couple of seconds, but it felt like eternity. As he gazed down, he only knew that the spinning world seemed to stand still and become focused on the tiny collected heap of misery at his feet. A fly buzzed in his ear, a dry, irritable, predatory sound that seemed intensely close, yet infinitely far away. Never had Aidan seen anything like the utter wretchedness of the small human at his feet. Nor had he observed such poverty or such desperate sickness, and he suddenly felt a deep and overwhelming desire to do something to help. But what could he do? Then he remembered the last vestiges of water in the bottle in his bag, and wrenching it out, he unscrewed the cap, and crouching down by the body, tipped it gently over the upturned face. The water fell on the child's forehead and trickled down over his cheeks, making dark furrows in the dust and grime. Hot tears welled up in Aidan's eyes as a feeling of utter helplessness overwhelmed him, and putting the now empty bottle beside the little form, he rose clumsily to his feet and stumbled back to the village, all thought of rest and shade forgotten.
When he arrived back at the garage, it was with profound relief that he saw another tour bus coming down the track in a cloud of dust, and soon all the passengers were transferred to the new vehicle for their return journey. Aidan sat on the coach in a state of shock, hardly noticing his fellow travellers, who were hot, grumpy and complaining. He'd never thought that poverty looked like this, and his mind hurled 100 desperate questions at him. Where are the child's parents? Have they died and left him there? Should I have done anything about him? But what could I do? How, in a country where there is so much wealth, he thought desperately, can things like this be allowed to exist? Then the realization dawned that this was what happened to the very poor in this society. The city he'd been enjoying was actually an artificially created world, a rich man's playground, where the rich got richer and the poor got poorer, and where, no doubt, there were slums in which even more appalling things happened to the sick and frail. While all these thoughts were swirling round in his head, he could see the face of the child in his mind's eye, like a perpetual watermark on his sight, through which the houses on the outskirts of the city swam like mirages.
Eventually the tour bus arrived back in the city centre, and Aidan dragged himself to the hotel and out onto the terrace. A waiter brought him a drink, and Aidan looked at the man with new eyes. Then his gaze strayed to the pool on the next terrace, where 2 children were standing under the fountain, letting the water stream over their faces and down across their plump little bodies. What a contrast! Half unconsciously, words began to form themselves in his mind, and taking a pen and paper out of his bag, he began to write them down before he forgot them. He had been good at English at school, and in moments of stress or joy had jotted down scraps of poetry. He had never shared these with anyone, as he was sure they were rubbish. As he wrote and rewrote, some of the tension went out of him, and in an odd way he felt as if he was doing something positive about his horrible experience. For a long while he wrestled with words, changing and replacing them, until at last he felt as if the poem was as near perfect as possible. In order to get some appreciation of how it sounded, he read it over to himself in a quiet undertone.
Which of the sky's legion of bright raindrops would I be? Would I drop into the limitless ocean, there to ride breaker and spindrift, lazing gently in warm ocean currents, then to slide down the tectonic escalators of the world and rupture forth at length in a dense carbonated gas cloud, or to daintily alight on a green leaf landing stage and a diamond glisten in the dawn light, a painted beauty by great Mother Nature, and so to enter the osmotic dance of life. Perhaps an upland watershed calls, haunt of wild plover and smoking mist, to bounce past rock and peaty pool, gravel shallows and minnow darting deeps, to slow, town-fringed rivers and muddy estuaries, chuckling along the sides of yachts or jetting round the speedboat's screw. But here's a starving, upturned, dirty face. Round eyes too huge, patterned with flies and sores, to trickle gently down that face, one single, universal tear, soothing, caressing, healing.
He'd just finished saying the poem to himself and was having second thoughts about a word in the last stanza when Rhys eased his great bulk down on the chair beside him.
"Had a good day, then?" he inquired. "What's that you're writing?" And before Aidan could stop him, he grabbed his notebook and read the poem. "What on earth brought this on?" he inquired, as if his nephew had suddenly begun to exhibit the symptoms of measles. Aidan could detect the exasperation in his voice, so he told him of the breakdown, the village, and the sick, emaciated child. "That child really got to me," he said wretchedly, the feeling of helplessness engulfing him once more. "I guess the whole country is full of little children like him," he added miserably, staring at his hands and shaking his head in despair. "Don't give them a second thought," snapped Rhys sharply. "They're only rubbish of the world. He'll be dead by tomorrow. His family will be much better off without him." "But he's a human being," exclaimed Aidan in astonishment, looking his uncle full in the face and searching in vain for some hint of compassion. "Doesn't that count for anything?" "Thousands more to take his place," retorted Rhys in exasperation. "Just rubbish. Rubbish, that's all they are. Don't waste your time on them, Aidan. But I can see you don't believe me. I'll leave you to your misguided sympathy and your silly poems." And with that he strode off into the hotel, muttering, "Poems! What rubbish!" under his breath.
That evening, Rhys came down to dinner with a determined look on his face. Aidan didn't notice, as he was still too shocked by the day's experiences. Halfway through the meal, as they were waiting for the dessert trolley, he gave Aidan his bedroom door key and asked him to fetch a book from his bedside. As soon as he was out of sight, Rhys leant over and slipped some powder into Aidan's glass of wine. Dessert over, he sat back in his chair, lit a cigarette, and announced,
"It's our last night, Aidan. Why don't you come out with me and paint the town red?"
Normally, Aidan would have said no to this request, after seeing his uncle's late-night return earlier on in the holiday, but unaccountably he'd begun to feel happier, as if he really didn't care about anything.
"Let's finish this bottle of wine, Aidan," he continued, "and then you can decide." And he looked shrewdly across the table, like a gardener who examines his tomatoes to see if they are ready to pick. By the end of the bottle, Aidan was more than content to do anything Rhys suggested, and even the face of the little child had miraculously disappeared from his memory.
Half an hour later, they were travelling in a taxi which wound its way up the hill behind the hotel and into the poorer part of the city. Aidan, sitting on the back seat, was in a contented haze and wondered idly where the car was taking them.
"Not that I really care," he thought. "I don't care about anything." And smiling happily, he lolled back in his seat, thinking that Rhys wasn't as bad as all that. In fact, he couldn't really remember what he disliked about his uncle. Sometime later he was dimly aware that the taxi had stopped. Rhys came round to Aidan's door and helped him out, keeping a steadying hand under his elbow. Aidan tried to take his arm away, but his uncle gripped him even tighter, marched him across the road, and knocked on what appeared to Aidan to be a shop door. "We're going shopping," he thought happily to himself, and waited placidly on the road, while Rhys had a conversation with someone just inside. They were then admitted into a hallway where Aidan could see several scantily clad young women sitting in a row on a couple of couches. What are they doing here? He thought. Perhaps this is a meeting we've come to, and not a shop after all. Reese dumped him on an empty chair and had a long conversation with a fearsome-looking woman sitting behind a desk. Glancing blearily at the girls again, Aidan saw they all wore brightly coloured wraps. The colours made his head spin. But, as he looked closer, he was fascinated to see that apart from these garments they were naked. Sexual excitement began to rise inside him as he glimpsed bare thighs and breasts. "It's a dream," he said out loud, feeling suddenly more alert than he had all evening. "I'm going to talk to them." And he half rose out of his seat. At that moment his uncle came back to him, rubbing his hands together in a satisfied way. "Go in there, boy," he ordered, catching hold of Aidan's arm once more.
Reese then steered his nephew into a room and shut the door firmly behind him. On a bed, on the far side of the room, lay a young woman. She was naked and lay with her legs apart and eyes tightly closed. To Aidan, in his confused state, it suddenly seemed that the moment he had imagined so many times in his erotic daydreams had suddenly become a reality.
Uttering a grunt of animal pleasure and anticipation, he scrambled hastily out of his trousers and threw himself onto the bed between the legs of the prone female body, totally taken over by his desire to make love to this wonderful dream woman. As the first passionate, exultant strokes of his virgin love-making began, the girl beneath him began to twist and turn. Without thinking, he grasped the slight body tightly, holding it in a vice-like grip, and pushed deeper and harder. Then the screaming began. He'd never heard such an awful sound before. It was a high-piercing, continuous shriek that knifed through his head into the very centre of his brain. Appalled, he rocked back on his heels, and gazing down with startled eyes at the girl beneath him, saw to his horror that she was bleeding and writhing in agony. Quickly he struggled off the bed, and catching the handkerchief out of his shirt pocket, threw it over the contorted face. At that moment the door opened, and a small woman, one of those who'd been sitting on the couch in the outer hall, hurled herself into the room, also shrieking, but this time in anger. Before he'd had time to draw breath, she threw herself on him, and although small, propelled him out of the door and into the waiting room with considerable force, hurling his trousers after him. Aidan staggered across the room and collapsed onto a chair, where he lapsed into a state of near unconsciousness.
In the room, Yara held Tiss and rocked her backwards and forwards, repeating fiercely over and over again, "I'll get you out of here, Tiz. I will! I will!" But Tiz was beyond hearing and lay in her arms, broken and violated, clutching the handkerchief over her face, rigid with pain and terror.
You have been listening to Tiz, from the novel The Garden of Sparkling Delight.
You may find more information by searching the web for The Garden of Sparkling Delight.
Soaring to the skies with the wind in your hair, a safe place only you can hide, trusting in those to keep you safe from harm. No hope tomorrow, nowhere to run. you would fly with an eagle, sheltered in his wings, soaring to the skies with the wind